Picture this. The year is 1644, and the most powerful woman in the world sits dying in her own filth. Her name is Isabella of Bourbon, Queen of Spain, and her body is literally crawling with vermin. The stench emanating from her royal chambers is so overwhelming that even her most loyal servants gag as they approach. But here's the truly horrifying part. This isn't some prisoner in a dungeon or a beggar on the streets. This is the Queen of the Spanish Empire, ruler of territories spanning 4 continents, and she hasn't changed her undergarments in over a year. What started as a bizarre religious vow would spiral into one of history's most catastrophic public health disasters, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives and forever changing our understanding of disease transmission. This is the incredible true story of how royal vanity, religious extremism, and medieval ignorance created the perfect storm for a plague that would make the Black Death look like a mild inconvenience. You're about to discover how one woman's twisted interpretation of piety literally brought an empire to its knees, and why this shocking tale remains one of history's most carefully buried secrets. Isabella Clara Eugenia of Austria wasn't born to be Queen of Spain. She was born to be a weapon. Born in 1566 to Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in Europe, Isabella grew up in a world where kingdoms rose and fell based on strategic marriages and religious devotion. From the moment she could walk, she was groomed for one purpose: to further the glory of Catholic Spain through whatever means necessary. But Isabella was different from other royal children. Where most princesses learned to embroider and play the lute, Isabella spent her days in prayer and contemplation. She would lock herself in the palace chapel for hours, emerging only when physically dragged away by worried servants. Her father, Philip II, initially encouraged this religious fervor. After all, a pious daughter was good for the royal image. What Philip didn't realize was that his daughter's devotion was morphing into something far more sinister. Isabella began interpreting religious texts in increasingly extreme ways. She became obsessed with the concept of bodily mortification, the practice of deliberately causing discomfort or pain to oneself as a form of religious discipline. While this wasn't uncommon among medieval religious orders, Isabella took it to unprecedented levels. By age 16, she was wearing hair shirts embedded with metal spikes beneath her royal gowns. She slept on board instead of her luxurious royal bed. She fasted so frequently that court physicians worried for her health. But perhaps most disturbing of all, she began to view her own body as inherently sinful, something that needed to be punished and denied rather than cared for. In 1599, at age 33, Isabella married Albert VII, Archduke of Austria, in what was meant to be a political alliance that would strengthen Spanish control over the Low Countries. The marriage was arranged by Philip II as part of his grand strategy to maintain Catholic dominance in Europe. What he couldn't have predicted was how Isabella's religious extremism would manifest once she gained real power. The couple was granted sovereignty over the Spanish Netherlands, making Isabella a queen in her own right. For the first time in her life, she had the authority to impose her twisted religious views on an entire population. And impose them she did. Isabella's court became a bizarre mixture of opulent wealth and extreme asceticism. While her palaces glittered with gold and precious stones, the queen herself lived like a hermit. She attended state functions wearing the same dress for months at a time, refusing to change clothes because she believed that caring for one's appearance was vanity, and vanity was sin. But her most shocking practice was yet to come. In 1601, after a particularly intense religious revelation, Isabella made a vow that would echo through history. She declared that she would not change her undergarments until the Spanish forces achieved a significant military victory. This wasn't just symbolic. She literally meant she would wear the same underwear, day after day, until God granted Spain success in battle. What started as a supposedly temporary religious gesture quickly became something far more permanent and horrifying. The Spanish military campaign that Isabella was praying for was the Siege of Ostend, a strategic port city in present-day Belgium. Spanish forces had been besieging the city since 1601, and the conflict had become a brutal war of attrition. Isabella declared that she would maintain her vow of uncleanliness until Ostend fell to Spanish forces. The siege of Ostend would last 3 years, 3 months, and 13 days. For over 3 years, Isabella of Bourbon wore the same linen undergarments, never once removing them for washing or replacement. Court records from the period, discovered centuries later in Spanish archives, paint a picture so revolting that many historians initially dismissed them as enemy propaganda. According to these documents, by the end of the first year, Isabella's undergarments had begun to rot against her skin. The fine linen had turned black and was literally disintegrating. The smell was so overwhelming that members of her own court began making excuses to avoid royal audiences. Foreign diplomats reported that meetings with the Spanish queen required them to breathe through perfume-soaked handkerchiefs. But Isabella viewed the physical discomfort as evidence of her spiritual purity. She declared that the worse her body felt, the closer she was getting to God. She began preaching to her courtiers about the virtue of holy filth, claiming that washing one's body was an act of pride that distanced the soul from divine grace. What makes this even more horrifying is that Isabella's religious extremism began to influence other members of the Spanish nobility. Several court ladies, eager to curry favor with the queen, began adopting similar practices. Soon, the Spanish court, one of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in Europe, had become a fetid cesspool of unwashed bodies and rotting clothing. Foreign visitors were shocked. The Venetian ambassador wrote to his government describing the Spanish court as a den of pestilence where the very air seems poisoned by the breath of demons. The French envoy was more direct. He simply refused to return after his first diplomatic mission, claiming that another visit would likely kill him. But the real horror was just beginning, because while Isabella and her followers were congratulating themselves on their spiritual purity, they were creating the perfect breeding ground for something far more dangerous than royal eccentricity. They were creating a plague factory. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the medieval mind's relationship with hygiene and disease. In Isabella's time, the prevailing medical theory was based on the furhumors, the ancient Greek belief that illness was caused by imbalances of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile within the body. The idea that tiny invisible creatures could cause disease was still centuries away from acceptance. This meant that when people started getting sick around Isabella's court, no one connected it to the horrific sanitary conditions. Instead, they blamed everything from bad air to God's displeasure with insufficient piety. The irony is almost unbearable. The sicker people got, the more convinced Isabella became that she needed to be even filthier to appease divine wrath. But modern science can explain exactly what was happening in Isabella's undergarments during those 3 horrific years. The combination of human waste, sweat, menstrual blood, and dead skin created a perfect breeding ground for bacteria, parasites, and other pathogens. The rotting fabric became a living ecosystem of microscopic life, all of it hostile to human health. Lice were probably the first inhabitants of this biological disaster zone. These tiny insects thrive in dirty clothing and can carry dangerous diseases like typhus. Within weeks of beginning her vow, Isabella would have been crawling with lice. These insects would have spread to anyone who came into close contact with her, including servants, courtiers, and her own husband. But lice were just the beginning. As the months wore on, Isabella's undergarments became home to increasingly dangerous organisms. Staphylococcus and streptococcus bacteria, which cause everything from skin infections to deadly sepsis, would have multiplied rapidly in the warm, moist environment of her rotting clothes. Even worse were the parasitic worms. Several species of intestinal parasites can survive for extended periods in human waste, and Isabella's condition would have provided them with an ideal breeding ground. These parasites would have weakened her immune system, making her even more susceptible to other diseases. The smell that courtiers complained about wasn't just unpleasant, it was toxic. The gases produced by rotting organic matter can actually be harmful to human health, especially in enclosed spaces like palace chambers. People who spent extended periods around Isabella were literally being poisoned by the air they breathed. But perhaps most dangerous of all were the rat-borne diseases that Isabella's condition attracted. The smell of rotting organic matter draws rats like a magnet, and rats carry fleas that can transmit bubonic plague. Palace records show a dramatic increase in rat sightings during the period of Isabella's vow, along with numerous reports of dead rats found in palace corridors. By the time Ostend finally fell to Spanish forces in September 1604, Isabella had become a walking biological weapon, and she was about to unleash that weapon on an unsuspecting population. When news arrived that Ostend had finally surrendered, Isabella declared a great celebration. After 3 years, 3 months, and 13 days, she could finally change her undergarments. But the damage was already done. The pathogens that had been breeding in her clothing had already spread far beyond the confines of her private chambers. The celebration itself became a super-spreader event of medieval proportions. Isabella, still wearing her disease-ridden garments, presided over public ceremonies attended by thousands of people. She blessed crowds, participated in religious processions, and held court with foreign dignitaries. Each interaction spread the biological disaster that she had become to new victims. The first cases appeared within days. Palace servants began developing strange fevers and skin rashes. Several died within weeks, their bodies covered in weeping sores that court physicians had never seen before. But instead of recognizing these as symptoms of infectious disease, royal doctors blamed an excess of melancholic humor and prescribed treatments that made the situation worse. The contagion spread outward from the palace like ripples in a pond. Servants carried it to their families in the city. Courtiers brought it to their estates in the countryside. Foreign diplomats carried it back to their own courts, spreading the plague across international borders. Within 6 months, what historians now call Isabella's Plague had spread across the Spanish Netherlands, into France, and down into Spain itself. The symptoms were unlike anything people had seen before, a combination of typhus, dysentery, and various parasitic infections that created a perfect storm of human misery. Contemporary accounts describe cities where the dead were piled in the streets because gravediggers couldn't keep up with the death toll. In Brussels alone, over 15,000 people died in the first year of the outbreak. Entire villages were abandoned as their populations fled in terror or simply died off completely. What made Isabella's plague particularly horrifying was its effect on pregnant women and children. The combination of diseases seemed especially deadly to these vulnerable populations. Infant mortality rates in affected areas approached 90%. Entire generations were wiped out, leaving behind ghost towns that wouldn't recover for decades. The economic impact was equally devastating. Trade ground to a halt as merchants refused to enter affected areas. Agricultural production collapsed as farmers fled their fields or died at their plows. The Spanish Empire, already strained by constant warfare, found itself dealing with a domestic catastrophe that threatened its very existence. But perhaps most tragically, Isabella herself remained convinced that the plague was God's punishment for insufficient piety. Rather than recognizing her role in the disaster, she ordered increased religious observances and even stricter cleanliness restrictions. Some nobles, desperate to curry favor with the queen, began their own vows of uncleanliness, ensuring that the plague would continue to spread and mutate. As the death toll mounted and the Spanish Empire teetered on the brink of collapse, a small group of advisors finally grasped the connection between Isabella's behavior and the catastrophic plague sweeping across Europe. But instead of confronting the queen directly, a move that could be considered treason, they chose a different approach, a massive historical cover-up that would last for centuries. The first step was controlling the narrative. Royal chroniclers were ordered to record the plague as a mysterious divine punishment with no earthly cause. Any documents that mentioned Isabella's vow or described the unsanitary conditions at court were either destroyed or locked away in secret archives. Physicians who dared to suggest a connection between the royal court and the plague found themselves exiled or worse. But the cover-up went far beyond simple censorship. The Spanish government launched what might be history's first propaganda campaign designed to shift blame for a public health disaster. They paid chroniclers in other countries to write competing accounts that blamed the plague on everything from Jewish conspiracies to French biological warfare to divine displeasure with Protestant heresy. The strategy was brilliant in its cynicism. By creating multiple competing explanations for the plague, they ensured that no single theory would gain enough credence to threaten the monarchy. Historians would spend centuries debating the true cause of Isabella's plague, never realizing that the answer was literally rotting away in the Spanish queen's underwear. Isabella herself was quietly isolated from public appearances. Official explanations claimed that she was in spiritual retreat, but the reality was that court physicians had finally convinced her advisors that she was a walking biological weapon. She was essentially quarantined in her own palace, attended only by servants who were considered expendable. The Queen's death in 1633 provided the perfect opportunity to complete the cover-up. Her body was immediately sealed in a lead-lined coffin and buried in a ceremony attended by almost no one. All of her personal belongings, including the infamous undergarments, were burned. The official cause of death was listed as holy fever, but palace records suggest she died from complications related to the massive infections that had been ravaging her body for decades. Even Isabella's funeral became part of the propaganda campaign. Spanish authorities spread stories about miraculous healings occurring near her tomb, suggesting that she had died as a saint rather than as the cause of one of history's worst public health disasters. Several of these miracles were later revealed to be nothing more than people recovering from non-fatal illnesses, but the stories served their purpose of deflecting attention from the truth. The cover-up was so successful that by the end of the 17th century, most people had forgotten that Isabella's plague had any connection to the Spanish court at all. The disaster was simply remembered as one of many mysterious medieval plagues, its true cause buried beneath layers of propaganda and deliberate historical amnesia. While the immediate death toll of Isabella's plague was devastating, the long-term consequences were even more profound. The demographic catastrophe reshaped European society in ways that are still visible today. Entire regions of the Spanish Netherlands and southern France were depopulated for generations. Some areas didn't recover their pre-plague population levels until the 19th century. This demographic collapse contributed to the decline of Spanish power and the rise of other European nations, particularly France and England, who were able to expand into territories that Spain could no longer effectively control. The plague also had unexpected cultural consequences. The massive death toll, particularly among children, led to fundamental changes in European attitudes toward family size and child mortality. Parents who had survived Isabella's plague became obsessed with having large numbers of children to ensure family survival, contributing to the population boom of the 18th century. Religious practices changed as well. The association between extreme piety and death caused many people to reject the kind of fanatical religiosity that Isabella had represented. This contributed to the gradual secularization of European society and the rise of Enlightenment thinking that emphasized reason over faith. Perhaps most importantly, Isabella's plague inadvertently advanced medical science. Physicians who witnessed the disaster began to question traditional theories about disease causation. While they didn't yet understand germ theory, they started to notice connections between sanitation and health that would eventually lead to modern medical breakthroughs. The economic consequences were equally far-reaching. The collapse of trade and agriculture in affected regions contributed to the decline of the Spanish Empire and the shift of economic power toward Northern Europe. Cities like Amsterdam and London, which had been largely spared from the plague, experienced massive growth as merchants and artisans fled from affected areas. Even European fashion was affected. The association between Isabella's dirty clothing and disease led to increased emphasis on cleanliness and frequent clothing changes among the upper classes. The elaborate daily dress changes that became common in 18th-century aristocratic society can be traced directly back to revulsion at Isabella's practices. But perhaps the most tragic long-term consequence was the lost opportunity for medical advancement. If the connection between Isabella's behavior and the plague had been openly acknowledged and studied, European medicine might have advanced by centuries. Instead, the cover-up ensured that valuable lessons about disease transmission and prevention were lost, leading to countless future outbreaks that could have been prevented. For over 3 centuries, Isabella's terrible secret remained buried in Spanish archives, protected by layers of bureaucracy and deliberate misfiling. The few historians who stumbled across references to her vow dismissed them as enemy propaganda or religious allegory. It wasn't until the 1960s that Spanish historian Dr. Carmen Soto Caba accidentally uncovered the truth while researching an entirely different topic. Dr. Soto Caba was studying Spanish colonial administration when she discovered a series of coded diplomatic dispatches in the Archive of the Indies in Seville. The dispatches, written by Spanish officials in the Americas, contained urgent requests for medical supplies and physicians to deal with a mysterious pestilence that had arrived on ships from Europe. The timing and descriptions matched perfectly with Isabella's plague, but these documents contained details that had been censored from European records. The colonial officials, writing in code to avoid censorship, described symptoms that modern medical science immediately recognized as typhus, dysentery, and various parasitic infections, exactly the combination of diseases that would have resulted from Isabella's horrific sanitary practices. More importantly, they traced the outbreak directly to passengers who had recently attended court functions in Brussels. Armed with this evidence, Dr. Soto Caba began a systematic search through Spanish archives, looking for documents that had been misfiled or deliberately hidden. What she discovered was a paper trail that led directly back to Isabella's underwear. Palace account books showed massive expenditures on perfumes and incense during the period of Isabella's vow, clearly an attempt to mask the smell. Medical records described treatments for unusual skin ailments affecting members of the royal household. Most damning of all were the personal letters of foreign ambassadors, written in diplomatic cipher, that described the Spanish court as a pestilent den and warned their governments about the health risks of diplomatic contact. Dr. Soto Caba's findings, published in 1967, caused a sensation in academic circles. For the first time, historians had documentary proof that a single individual's poor hygiene had caused one of Europe's worst disease outbreaks. The revelation forced a complete reassessment of medieval medicine, royal power, and the relationship between personal behavior and public health. But the Spanish government wasn't happy about having their royal ancestors exposed as plague carriers. They initially tried to suppress Dr. Soto Caba's research, claiming it damaged Spain's historical reputation. When that failed, they launched their own propaganda campaign, funding alternative studies that attempted to disprove the connection between Isabella and the plague. The controversy raged for decades. Some historians accepted the evidence, while others clung to older explanations for the plague. It wasn't until the 1990s, when genetic analysis of plague victims' remains confirmed the presence of multiple disease organisms that matched Dr. Soto Caba's theory, that the academic community finally accepted the truth. Isabella's story might seem like a bizarre historical curiosity, but it contains lessons that are startlingly relevant to our modern world. In an age of global pandemics, anti-vaccine movements, and politically motivated science denial, the Spanish Queen's catastrophic ignorance serves as a warning about what happens when personal beliefs triumph over public health. The parallels are uncomfortable but undeniable. Just as Isabella convinced herself that filthiness was a virtue, modern society has seen people convince themselves that masks are oppression, that vaccines are poison, and that medical expertise is just opinion. The mechanisms of denial are identical across the centuries. People choose beliefs that make them feel virtuous or special, regardless of the consequences for others. Isabella's plague also demonstrates how quickly misinformation can spread and how difficult it is to correct false narratives once they become established. The Spanish government's propaganda campaign successfully buried the truth for over 3 centuries, just as modern misinformation campaigns can convince millions of people to believe demonstrably false claims about medicine, science, and public policy. Perhaps most importantly, Isabella's story shows how individual actions can have global consequences. In our interconnected world, a single person's poor decisions can affect millions of others. The anti-vaccine parent who refuses to immunize their children isn't just making a personal choice. They're potentially exposing entire communities to preventable diseases. The conspiracy theorist who refuses to wear a mask during a pandemic isn't just risking their own health. They're endangering everyone they encounter. The cover-up aspect of Isabella's story also has modern relevance. Governments and institutions still try to hide their failures and shift blame when public health disasters occur. The initial Chinese government response to COVID-19, attempts by various governments to downplay air pollution or water contamination, and corporate efforts to hide the health effects of their products all follow the same pattern established by Isabella's advisors 4 centuries ago. But there's also hope in Isabella's story. Dr. Soto Caba's discovery shows that truth has a way of surfacing, even after centuries of suppression. Modern scientific methods, global communication networks, and transparent research practices make it much harder to bury inconvenient truths for extended periods. The medical advances that followed from studying Isabella's plague also demonstrate how disasters can sometimes lead to progress. The Black Death led to improvements in European medicine and sanitation. The 1918 flu pandemic spurred developments in virology and vaccine research. COVID-19 has accelerated the development of mRNA vaccines and telemedicine. Isabella's plague, once its true cause was understood, contributed to our modern understanding of how personal hygiene affects public health. As we reach the end of this incredible tale, it's worth reflecting on the sheer magnitude of what happened. A single woman's twisted interpretation of religious devotion killed hundreds of thousands of people, reshaped European demographics, contributed to the fall of an empire, and remained hidden from history for over 3 centuries. Isabella of Bourbon wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. She wasn't motivated by cruelty or malice. She genuinely believed that her disgusting behavior was bringing her closer to God and making her a better person. This might be the most terrifying aspect of her story: the capacity for well-intentioned people to cause massive harm through willful ignorance and stubborn adherence to dangerous beliefs. Her legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between personal freedom and social responsibility. Isabella had the power to make choices about her own body, but those choices had consequences that extended far beyond her own life. In a world where individual decisions can affect millions of others, how much personal freedom can society afford to tolerate? The 3-century cover-up of Isabella's story also reminds us that history is written by the winners, and sometimes the winners are the ones who successfully hide their failures. How many other historical disasters have been misattributed or deliberately obscured? How many lessons that could prevent future suffering have been lost to propaganda and institutional self-interest? But perhaps most importantly, Isabella's story demonstrates the power of basic scientific knowledge and rational thinking. The plague that killed hundreds of thousands could have been prevented by something as simple as changing clothes regularly. The disaster that toppled empires could have been avoided if a single person had chosen cleanliness over religious fanaticism. In our own time, as we face global challenges from climate change to pandemic disease to technological disruption, Isabella's story serves as both a warning and an inspiration. It warns us about the dangers of allowing ideology to override evidence, but it also shows us that even the most entrenched problems can be solved through careful research, brave truth-telling, and commitment to scientific understanding. The Spanish queen who never changed her underwear may have lived for centuries ago, but her story is timelessly relevant. In a world where personal choices have global consequences, where misinformation spreads faster than disease, and where the powerful often try to hide their failures, Isabella's plague reminds us that the price of ignorance is measured not just in individual suffering, but in the fate of civilizations. The next time you change your clothes, wash your hands, or trust medical advice over political rhetoric, remember Isabella of Bourbon. Her horrific example shows us that civilization itself depends on our willingness to choose science over superstition, community welfare over personal vanity, and uncomfortable truths over comfortable lies. After all, as Isabella's plague proved, in the end, the truth always surfaces, even if it takes centuries to emerge from the filth where it was buried. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share, and comment below. See you in the next one.